Welcome to part 2 of our series about why it is that a bishop wears what he does during Mass and why he does what he does when he holds the staff, which we learned last week was called a crozier, when he wears the hat, the mitre, and when he doesn't, and why it is that all of that takes place during our liturgies. I should note that of the signs that we learned, the three symbols of the bishop's office or authority, the ring, the mitre, and the crozier, the mitre and the crozier are really only worn ceremonially during liturgies. The ring the bishop will wear with him wherever he goes, but the mitre and the crozier are specifically used during liturgies or maybe certain other events, like the Pope, I think, might wear it when he greets the people in public, but I don't see that very often, so I believe that they are exclusively used during the liturgy. And just like everything else in the liturgy, they carry a symbolic value with them. All that we do during the liturgy, all of the movements, all of the actions, all of the objects carry some sort of symbolism with them. And of course, since the mitre and the crozier symbolize the bishop's office and the authority that he has as a successor to the apostles, they have that kind of designation as authority. Before we touch on what they specifically do and what function they serve in the liturgy, it's worth reflecting for a moment that a liturgy is a kind of combination of several things going on when we look at any liturgy, but especially when we look at Mass. On the one hand, the celebrant, often the priest, but in this case we're talking about the bishop, the celebrant has two main roles. The first is to bestow God's blessing on the people present. This happens when the priest or the bishop gives a blessing, or when the priest or the bishop preaches or proclaims the gospel. In this sense, the person himself is transmitting something by being in the person of Jesus Christ. It is through their ordination, the holy orders, the sacrament that they received, that they are bestowing something upon the people gathered. And in that sense, they are being the authority in that moment. But there is a second and perhaps more important moment, and these are multiple moments scattered throughout the liturgy, is when the bishop or the priest, on behalf of himself and the people, is asking God to bestow His blessing upon us. Note the difference between the two. In the one hand, the priest or the bishop is acting in the person of Christ and bestowing something himself. And in the second movement, there is a reception on the part of the bishop or the priest with everyone else, asking God to bestow blessings upon each and every one of us. Because the bishop or the priest is not Jesus, is not God. And therefore, they are also a member of the church, a member of the congregation that is gathered. And so at certain moments in the liturgy, the bishop is the authority, and on certain members during the liturgy, the bishop is one of the recipients, one of many recipients present. When I celebrate Mass, I attempt to show this two-part movement with use of my eyes. You'll notice a lot of the times I will be looking straight ahead, or I'll be looking down, or I'll be looking at the book. And in those moments, if you pay attention to the words that I speak, they are directed at God, asking Him to bless us, to help us, to be with us. I'm not speaking to the congregation. I'm speaking to God with the congregation, on behalf of the congregation. And normally in those moments, what is the hand position of the priest? Hands up, right? In a receiving kind of gesture. Just as when we come forward for communion, we place our hands upward in a receiving kind of gesture, so too is the priest often using their hands. Now, not every priest does the orans position, that's what this is called, the same way. But the way I learned it was to place your hands upward, because in that sense you are receiving. God is the one doing the acting, and you are one of the recipients in that way. But when the priest is giving a blessing, the hands are this way. And when I am speaking to the congregation, you'll notice I look at people, because then I am in the person of Jesus Christ, and I am speaking a blessing, or I am addressing the people who are present. It's very easy to mix those two things up, or to not realize that those two different movements are going on throughout the Mass. So pay attention next time and try to notice when the priest is speaking to everyone as the celebrant, and when he is speaking to God as a member of the congregation. This helps to explain why the bishop uses or doesn't use these items of his office during the Mass. The crozier is only used, more or less, when the bishop is coming in and going out, and when he hears the gospel, and when he bestows the final solemn blessing at the end of Mass. Those are perhaps the high points of authority, because we hear the gospel message proclaimed by Jesus. The bishop can, if he chooses, preach with the crozier in his hand as a sign and a symbol of his teaching authority as shepherd and guide. But the crozier is not used very much because, well, holding a crozier in your hand kind of limits what it is that you can do. The mitre is perhaps more interesting, and I think that's at the heart of the question most people have. Why does he take the hat off and put it on so often? And it has to do with those two movements. When the bishop is acting as the authority, as the celebrant in the person of Christ, he has his mitre on as a symbol that he is the one bestowing something upon those of us present. But when he takes the mitre off, he is speaking to God on behalf of the people. He is receiving that blessing that is being bestowed himself, on behalf of himself, and on behalf of everybody else. That's why it seems like he puts it on, he takes it off, he puts it on, he takes it off. That's because the Mass moves through those two movements so often that to convey that message appropriately liturgically, it seems a little much. But there is a reason for it happening as often as it does. Now, I should address one last question that often people have. What about the little beanie that he wears underneath the mitre? That is called a zucchetto. And liturgically, it doesn't serve much of a purpose. I think originally it served as a headpiece to keep the bishop's head warm, probably before they had furnaces in churches. But the zucchetto represents a cap for his head that goes underneath the mitre. And you'll notice it doesn't have much symbolism, except when does the bishop remove the zucchetto and put it back on? He removes it at the beginning of the Eucharistic prayer, and he puts it back on after communion has been distributed and Jesus, in his body and blood, is no longer present in the church except in the tabernacle. So, when Jesus is going to be present in the room, physically, and the bishop is no longer the most important, quote-unquote, person in the room liturgically, he removes his hat. This is why at those moments we kneel so often during Mass, because someone greater is now present in the room. And the bishop shows that in a very visible way by removing the zucchetto as a sign of respect and deference to Jesus, who is being made present and has become the most important person in the room in that sense. If you have any other questions about why the bishop does what he does or any of these kinds of things, please send them to my email address. God bless, and we'll see you next week.